Good evening, everybody. Welcome. It's full house. That's fantastic. The critical conversation, we hold this event once a month, and I must say that it's great pleasure to welcome my dear friend, Professor Roger Mac Ginty, as our speaker. I know Roger for a while. I think it was late 1990s, we started to work at the University of York, and in early parts of our academic career, I think we spent quite a bit of time. We learned quite a bit from each other. Whatever Roger has learned about styling sense, it's all from me. Before Roger met me, he had no style. So by looking at him tonight, you may be thinking, what happened? Well, I hadn't seen him for a long time, so I neglected him. But it's really wonderful to have Roger here because Roger is one of the key scholars in peace and conflict studies. And so whether it's the hybridity of peace building or everyday peace, he has come up with lots of new ideas, ways of thinking, and he's very influential. I mean, there's no doubt about that. And I think that influence comes for a number of reasons. As an academic, obviously, he has a very clear mind, sharp mind. But Roger also has a very warm heart. So with the former, you can expect, for most academics. But the latter, I think that's exceptional. Roger is a very special person. And I really would like to mention this because Roger is always there to help others. Whether it's the other academics or early career researchers, Roger always is a point of contact and assistance. So people love Roger in our field. And wherever he goes, you will see that the kind of congregation of people gathering around him. And he's a really special person. And he's a very prolific writer. I mean, he produces articles like nobody else. We edited a book together, and that was published this year, comparing peace processes. I think it was sometimes in March, April, it was published. And since then, Roger published probably another half a dozen books and journal articles. I don't know how he does it, but he is just amazing. And tonight, the power peace and the topic of his talk, I think is really important. So, when you visit different conferences, one particular phrase often comes up, and that is everyday. Now, academia is obsessed with everyday. So everyday peace building, everyday peacekeeping. We are really interested in what's happening in the daily lives of conflict-affected people. So I have Pamina Firchow here, and most of you know Pamina because she used to work here. And Pamina and Roger have been working on Everyday Peace project. And it's wonderful to bring Roger back here to talk about that project. And also really for our school and what we are trying to do with critical conversations. Bringing thought leaders, engaging our faculty, our students, but also our wider ESCAR family. So it's wonderful to see so many of you turning up tonight for this session. And the way that we are going to run the presentation, so we will have Roger to present first, and then my colleague, Professor Sarah Cope, will have a response to Roger's presentation, and a short response. And but that's coming from a professor of narrative, so we'll see how short that will be. And so after that, what I will do, normally we open the second part is kind of a group work, but tonight that's not going to work. We have so many people, so let's run just a normal bog standard Q&A session. But I like that Q&A session really as a conversation, right? So let's build up on Roger's presentation, because there are lots of people here working on peace and conflict studies from different angles. So I'm hoping that it's going to be really exciting session. So without any further ado, I'd like to invite Professor Roger Mac Ginty. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you very much. An extraordinarily generous introduction. And if there's one thing that Irish people can't stand, it's praise. So I found that very countercultural. So thank you very much for coming. It's very exciting to be here. I had a walk along the corridors of ESCAR earlier, and it was like walking through the best bibliography ever. You know, I was looking at the names on the office doors, and there were, you know, all of those names that I associate with leaders in the field, both established scholars and early career scholars. I'd also like to thank Alp and congratulate you on your new dean. Most of what he says is true. The comments on fashion, style, and sartorial elegance sadly are true as well. Alp and I both were at a conference at the University of Notre Dame over the weekend, and through coincidence, we more or less were wearing the same outfit. But somehow it looked as though I had slept in a dumpster. And Alp looked as though, you know, he was just off the pages of a fashion magazine. So I'm afraid that is true as well. I also, in my opening thanks, I want to thank whoever compiled this poster, because they used a picture of me from 10 years ago. And I've been listening to reviews of a new movie that has Robert De Niro in it, and it uses incredibly expensive CGI technology, the movie's called The Irishman, to make him look 30 years younger. This cost nothing. And it had the same effect. So congratulations and well done to whoever did that, and I will hire you for similar things. So in this talk, I would like to do two things. The first is to say that everyday peace is a form of power. And further to say that we need to take power back from the realists and from the security studies folks. It's about time that the peace studies folks also had something to say about power as well, and to take that back. And the second thing that I would like to do is to unpack this notion of everyday peace, unpack it conceptually, often in rather abstract terms. You know, I've been with Pamina, obviously, I've been working on this notion of everyday peace for some time, and what I want to do is really stop and unpack what we mean by that term. And in doing so, I also want to think about issues of scale. And I'm interested in the level below. So with much of our studies of peace and conflict, we're interested in this, the trickle-down peace, the peace accord, well, it's man peace, as you can see from the picture. It's very male, or the collage of pictures is very male, it's top-down, it's capital city peace, it's those who shout loudest, those with the most guns, get to the talks table. That sort of peace is very important, because very often it creates the context and it allows other forms of peace to take root. But this evening, I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in the level below. And in fact, I'm interested in the level below most levels. I'm interested in the level below civil society. I'm interested in the microdynamics of interpersonal exchange in deeply divided societies. I can sum it up in this rather glib picture. But we know what's happening in this picture. The dog and the cat are going to settle down for a convivial evening. But this could go badly wrong. There could be fur flying, there could be teeth, there could be claws. And I'm interested in the intimacy, the close quarters of people in deeply divided societies, of the queue or the line in the bakery, of how public transport is shared in cities in the former Yugoslavia, about how Christians and Muslims interact in the marketplaces of northern Nigeria or of Ambon province in Indonesia. I'm interested in the Serb and the Croat who might meet each other each morning in the stairwell of the apartment block that they share. So I'm interested in the level below the level that many of us talk about, that is civil society or formally organized peace building that's organized according to projects and programs, etc. Okay, and the sources of this very much come from the Everyday Peace Indicators project, which I've been working on with Pamina Firchow for many years, and it's lovely to see her here, as well as Jessica Smith, who keeps the whole show on the road and is a doctoral student at ESCAR. I'm also drawing on another source, and this is where I get a bit confessional, I guess. And we all have vices. Every one of us has a vice, or if you're like me, many vices. You know, we eat the wrong stuff, we drink the wrong stuff or too much of the wrong stuff, we smoke, we gamble, whatever. I'll sign up to many of those on that list, but I have another vice that I'm going to share with you. One that is, you know, that frankly I kept hidden for very, very many years, but it's turned out to be an amazing source. And that vice is I read voraciously war memoirs and personal diaries, particularly from World War I and World War II. Now, very many of these books have been written by the very people who should never write a book. Much of this is pulp non-fiction. These are, I'm sure, wonderful people who are wonderful to their families and small animals, but they should never have been let near a word processor or a diary. But in actual fact, some of these books are absolutely magnificent, I have to say. But they are a wonderful source, and I've been reading them for years, and then I was delighted to join the dots and say, I can use this as a source. And it got me thinking about how ahistorical much of peace and conflict studies is. How for many of us, self-included, the world began in 1989. Yet when I read about some poor French soldier freezing in a trench in 1917, I'm wondering, is that really very different from some poor Syrian who's been conscripted into Assad's army, who is terrified, who doesn't support Assad and is just trying to survive, or people in many other conflict-affected areas? So those are the two sources, main sources of my thinking on everyday peace. So how do I define everyday peace? And this is really the only piece of text I'm going to show, so apologies for that. I define it as the practices and norms deployed by individuals and groups in deeply divided societies to avoid and minimize conflict and awkward situations at both the intra and intergroup level. It's a form of tactical agency, a mode of thinking as well as a series of actions. It involves emotional intelligence and an ability to read situations and an ability to be opportunistic. It can be both conflict calming, but also conflict provoking. It is a highly adaptive form of governance. It often occurs in unthreatening and marginal spaces. Whether it is actually a form of peace rather than mere toleration is open for debate. It can be seen as a form of power. Everyday peace power. So that's a definition that I made up, and you can make up your own, and probably, would have a better one with additions. I think the important things to say is that this is a form of tactical agency. It's a mode of thinking. It's how people navigate their way through life. And in a way, all of us do this every day. How we navigate through socially awkward situations, how you live in a city in close proximity to very many other people. But this stuff really matters, I would suggest, in a deeply divided society. Navigate the wrong way, use the wrong language, act in a very obtrusive way, and this could bring you into danger for you and your family. So it's important how we use our social skills, our emotional intelligence. And these are, in an earlier work, these are some of the types of everyday peace, some of the activities: avoidance, ambiguity, ritualized politeness, telling, blame, deferring. And I know there are many in this room who have written about similar subjects and have lots of experience of writing, researching, and indeed engaging in practitioner work on these subjects. So I want to say that everyday peace is a form of power. And in order to do so, I think we, or certainly I, need to think, or need to alter my thinking on power. Because coming from an international relations background, I'm very used to orthodox views of power. Power that is coercive. It's power over. It's power that is used by states, institutions, military groups. It is power that is often quantifiable and measurable. It's a form of power often associated with a top-down dynamic. Often it creates both incentives and ways of disciplining. But I want to think of power, and particularly everyday peace power, in a more emancipatory way. So rather than power over, I want to think about power to, power with, power from. So immediately a very different sort of power, one that might lead security studies folks and realists going, that's not power. Where are your guns? Where are your rules? But in actual fact, I think one of the wonderfully subversive things about everyday peace is that it's a different form of power, a form of power that might go unnoticed by those that think they hold power, but actually don't hold legitimacy, don't hold a more expansive form of power that is, or could be, collective and ideally could be cosmopolitan. Fundamentally, and how this is a form of power, is that it has the potential to be disruptive. We're all aware of conflict resolution, conflict management, and conflict transformation. Really good tools, really help me think about responses to conflict. But I think there's one missing, and that is conflict disruption. The disruptive act that disrupts the logic of conflict. If you think about many conflict societies and governments and military organizations, they work on a notion of hegemonic thought, or the totalizing nature of war. We are A, therefore we hate B. B are untrustworthy. We are A, therefore we are at war with B. And all of us in A are united that we don't like B. But actually, if we think about everyday peace and everyday peace power, it punctures that, it disrupts that. It says that, hang on, not all Sudanese support President Bashir. It says not all German soldiers in 1916 and 17 were with the Kaiser. It allows space for different narratives, a different way of thinking. It punctures the I can't say that word this evening, the hegemonic way of the way or narrative that leaders have. And we can think about this everyday peace power at the ground level. We can think about it in terms of the charismatic individual in the neighborhood, in the community, who isn't involved in a formal community violence reduction scheme, but they are the most effective community violence reducer in the area because they are the scary aunt or the scary grandmother who will make sure that the grandson isn't going to join a gang, isn't going to join a militant organization. We can think of charismatic social entrepreneurs who run a boxing club, who run a small business that attracts people, where people congregate, and by their actions and by their words, for example, a friendship across a political or religious division, they show, actually, I don't think all of those people in Group B are bad. I don't think they're all evil. And we can think about the subversive nature of that and its ability to disrupt narratives and logic that say that war or division is totalizing. So that's everyday peace as a form of power. And then to move on to its constituent parts. These are found, I'm going to mention 3 constituent parts, and I think the very clever people in this room could probably come up with 33, but I'm going to restrict myself to 3. And we can find these in speech acts, in norms, in modes of thinking. And for me, they are sociality, reciprocity, and solidarity. And that maps on to weak, medium, and strong everyday peace. So sociality, that's recognizing the humanity in others, that the other side are a bit like us, you know, they dress just as badly as me. They have kids who are as cheeky, just like, you know, my kid. So it recognizes the humanity in others. And we can see this, for example, in the humane treatment of prisoners of war. We can see it in terms of respect for the other, everyday civility. We can see it in tolerance. Reciprocity, we're all aware what that means. Most major religions, as far as I understand it, have their version of reciprocity, basically, you know, do unto others as you would expect to be done to yourself. It's opening the door for someone. But think about that act of opening the door. I mean, why do we do it? Because it's very unlikely. So someone's coming, we open the door, they walk through, they say thank you, we say you're welcome, we go about our business. It's very unlikely that the gods of karma will make sure that the next time we're at that door, the same person is in a position to open the door for you. And, you know, we go through the ritual. In actual fact, reciprocity, in my interpretation, is a statement about the sort of society we want to live in. So it's broader than the actual act. And we can see this in terms of everyday peace in, for example, the system of manners, how, you know, we all say thank you to each other, and that diffuses situations, or we apologize. We can see it in the tacit ceasefires, which were incredibly common in World War I, where it wasn't as though a French soldier would put his head above the parapet and go, "Oi, Fritz, if you don't fire tonight, we won't fire." Instead, they worked it out. They fired high, or they were quiet. They had these tacit, unspoken ceasefires. And the war memoirs, which I've been reading under the bed covers in the hope that no one would see what I'm actually reading, bears this out, the huge number of tacit acts of reciprocity. And then finally, in my tripartite framework, I have solidarity. This one is difficult because solidarity is more than just speech. It means standing with the other or acting with the other. And you can think in a war-torn society, that's pretty difficult. That exposes you to criticism from your own side. But we can see it in villages in northern Uganda, where former child soldiers come back. And these child soldiers had been abducted, they've been brutalized, but they might also be perpetrators. And we can see it in which villagers welcome them back. They might not be welcomed with the most open arms ever. Might possibly be with folded arms. You're welcome, come back, but we'll be watching you. But still, that very act of standing with is important. So that, to me, is my framework of everyday peace. And I'm just going to finish with a caveat. And that is that all of this is gendered and conditioned by context and culture. So where you sit or where you come from depends on how you see this duck-rabbit picture. And I was really reminded by that on Sunday morning at the Notre Dame conference. I went to a really wonderful session on Native American approaches to peacebuilding, which was all about healing, all about the land and in a sense, a very sophisticated form of environmental peace or eco-peace. And it was quite humbling and a good reminder to me about how my thinking is very much straight line thinking. It's white man thinking from the global north. So it's useful, I think, to acknowledge that all of these forms of everyday peace will be embedded within particular cultures, within particular contexts, and must be seen through positionality. And then just to end, I want to end with 3 questions which you might like to consider. And I have semi-answers to them, but you might pick up on them in the Q&A. The first of these, is everyday peace really peace? Because you can say, well, a lot of the things I'm talking about, a Serb and a Croat saying hello in the morning, but that's it. It's not really peace. It might just be conciliation. It might be mere tolerance. It might simply be rubbing along to get along. It's not the peace of unicorns and rainbows and hugs. It's something more parsed than that. But my response to the question is, actually, in many cases, I think it is peace. Because we have to recognize the very low base that many of these contexts are at, and the immense bravery of those who quite literally, in some cases, put their head above the parapet, or those who, for example, in a public space, show politeness or friendship to someone from the other side in a deeply divided society. So with lots of caveats, I think it is peace. And I think that certainly from the comfortable space of academia where I find myself, sometimes I can be very ungenerous about concepts and very critical of them. But I think actually we should recognize that very often actions like this are a form of peace. The second question is, can everyday peace be scaled up? And certainly, Pamina and I find it just about everywhere when we talk about the everyday peace indicators. You know, I could, if I was a betting person, if I could add that to the list of my vices, I would bet that we are guaranteed the question of, that's great. That tells us a lot of detail about this particular spot on the planet. But can it be scaled up? What does it tell us about the wider society? And yes, I think everyday peace can be scaled up, but I think it's more fruitful to think about scaling out rather than scaling up, to think horizontally, to think about the blotting paper, to think about the imitative potential of that charismatic social leader who has got a great friend from the other side, who doesn't demonize the other side, or to think about the scary grandmother who disciplines the grandson to make sure he doesn't join the militant group or the gang or whatever. So I think I certainly can do a little more thinking on scaling out rather than scaling up. And then can we as researchers and practitioners access everyday peace? This to me is a tricky one. Sure, we have through the Everyday Peace Indicators projects and lots of other projects that have involved participatory action research. But I think a lot of this everyday peace is so mundane that it's very difficult to see. It's so embedded into the everyday that it's hidden in plain sight. Or it happens behind closed doors. It happens in the home, literally behind closed doors. Or it happens in those spaces where there is the hidden transcript, James C. Scott's hidden transcript. So it's difficult for outsiders to access. And I guess there's the other question which follows on from that, and I don't have a ready answer, and I know there are lots of practitioners in this room who are in a better place to answer it than me. And that is, well, if we can access it, what do we do with it? You know, I'm reminded of the dog chasing the car. You know, what's it going to do if it catches the car? It can't drive. So what are we going to do if we capture everyday peace? Because the danger is if we try to scale it up, if we try to manufacture it, we turn something organic into something inorganic, and it loses the very value that it had in the first place. But of course, that's really difficult, because as peace builders, we want to help. You know, that's our job. And we're always looking to find an in or a way in. But maybe, I'm sure, many in this room have an answer to that question and the others. So, thank you very much.
Right, okay, well, I think you should dedicate this lecture to angry grandmothers in the protection of peace. And you mentioned them a number of times in your presentation. Roger, that was fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think it was really insightful, and the way that you illustrate the challenges of everyday peace and what happens. Also, the last three questions that you posed to our audience. And so I think it's going to bring lots of new questions. But before that, while you are thinking about your questions, I will just ask Professor Sarah Cobb now for some reflections so that perhaps we can contextualize some of those issues mentioned.
Okay, so this was fabulous. And, you know, I'm completely excited, and you should see my notebook. It's filled with scribbles and arrows going So that lots of explosions for me.
What? That's rubbish?
That's not rubbish. That looks like rubbish, but it's not rubbish. So I wanted to tell you one of the explosions that was going off for me. First, I think you're really headed in a great direction. I think this is a wonderful avenue for us to explore and try to understand and support, let's say. Let's say peace-building practice is no longer the design of anything, it's the support of things, right? Which would be a different positionality for the field, which would be interesting. But before I get to that, I wanted to tell you of one of the explosions, and it was really in your word disruption. Because from me, these local practices, these speech acts, these everyday interactions with people take place as narrative enactments, right? They're performances of stories on a landscape that's already populated with stories, right? No, there is no landscape that's not already colonized with narratives. So when the two folks meet in the corridor in the apartment building and say hi, it looks like a non-event to me or you, but from their perspective, it's a disruption. It's a destabilization of the fracture lines, the lines of fracture that you have in divided societies. So what would be interesting, well, let me go on and I'll finish that in a second. So in the world of narrative, there's a literature on destabilization, right? And it's all about how do you destabilize stories. And they're often, John Winslade conceptualized this as destabilization through the presence of counter-narratives. And that's not the narrative of no. That's not narrative A and then negative A. That's a story that disrupts the core features of what makes narrative coherent. So it becomes a really interesting activity to try to figure out, okay, how do we do this? Well, we know some things about that. And I'm not going to go into that now because I could get a lecture on right now. I'll bring myself back to your comments. And one of the things that concern me that I want, first let me tell you two things. I was going to draw something for you and then I'll come back to the question. So if you imagine, folks, this is a wall that erases for those of you that don't know. If you imagine that there's this is a story, right? This is blah, 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 a story, right? And when we look at these speech acts in a coffee shop or in the corridor or at the market, because that's the level of, that micro level is what you're thinking about, we have no idea of what's going on here. So this points to me, your project points to me, not just to watching these, but to tracking what they mean to the people that are involved, right? So it changes peacebuilding from being the study to how to make people do something or be something to how to create the containers and the spaces for explicating this, for understanding this. Because one thing is to have researchers go and say, oh, tell me what this means. But the other thing is to set up places, maybe like this place tonight. I'm hoping will be a place where we can, share ideas, and it's a container, this place, and then maybe some other, better forms than this one, perhaps, for exploring at the reflective meta level what are the stories we have in operation. So that got me real excited. Now I have my question. So my husband's from Argentina. He's here. Where is he? There he is. He's taking notes. Look at him. That's a good sign. And, he came to the States in 71 from Argentina and escaping basically the onset of the political repression in Argentina. So it's very close up and dear, this fractured society, lost friends, lost family, and still Argentina remains fractured today around lots of this history. So in the and this book, and speaking of books you'd like to read, there's a book called Imagining Argentina, which it's a novel, and it tells the story of repression, basically, how it lives in the everyday life of people. And in that, so we ought to study first, my question to you, Roger, would be, what does everyday repression look like, So we ought to have, another set of speech acts or a different way of understanding this, because saying hello to people may be an act of compliance. you've got a boss that belongs to the other side, and you say good morning, and it is, it's a genuflect in front of the narrative that is the oppressive narrative. So, how do you do it? How does it work in a society? And maybe we kind of have that here in our society too. We have such a divided society here that there are things we can't say. Uncles that can't talk to their nephews, dining room tables conversations that can't take place. So how do we, what's the line, basically, Roger, between everyday peace and everyday repression? That's my question. Now you can clap. That was a good question.
And that's the everyday repression here at ESCAR. Right, everybody. I think this was a very powerful night.
Is he going to answer the question?
Absolutely. You see the repression here.
This is called power. This is grandmother power.
Exactly. But the question is just so powerful that he needs to think about it.
Okay, all right.
Right?
That's good. Okay.
And he's taking notes. Roger, are you ready to answer that question?
Badly.
Badly? Okay. Let's answer that question, and then I'll open the floor for questions.
Okay. Should I stand or should I?
Yes.
Probably that would be better. Yes.
Oh, yes. Yes. Sarah said yes, and I feel I should stand in a confessional stance.
I have 11 grandchildren.
That just sounded like a threat. I have 11 grandchildren.
It makes me the scary grandmother.
Yeah. Yet again, I make public remarks and find myself in a landmine or in a minefield. Yeah. I think it's a very good question. Is where is the dividing line between everyday repression, everyday peace? I don't think there's a clear one. I think intersectionality teaches us that everything is pretty fuzzy. But wonderfully, human beings are able to play multi-level games. They're able to carve out spaces of subversion, spaces of non-compliance, while simultaneously being compliant in other aspects of their life. And one of the really interesting and really scary things, which no doubt your husband could talk about, and many others who have lived through repression, is how people become complicit in their own repression because they're imbricated, implicated in the system. And it's very difficult, in fact, suicidal sometimes, to stand up against that. And very often the complicity is very subtle. So the way, the problem I have with complexity theory is it's too complex for someone like me. But from the little I have read about that, my understanding of peace and conflict is that they are systems. They are assemblages. And I have used the metaphor of circuits and circuitry, both biological circuits, like a root system, but also electronic circuits. And you can think of the main circuitry, the main circuit, which might be one of state power involving repression. But there might be mini circuits and micro circuits that are hidden, secret, temporal, and they might involve spaces for resistance, a lack of compliance, alternative narratives. So I think if we do engage in systems thinking or complexity theory, we can see how everyday repression and peace and a whole lot of other things reside in the one system. And also it's worth pointing out how all of this is riddled with power. All of this is gendered. There are demographics, there are issues of status and socio-economic placeholding, etc., etc. So I hope that is the sort of answer that would allow the grandchild to leave the living room unscathed.